Good morning,
Good morning.
Mr. Adam Ellwanger. Am I pronouncing that correctly, sir?
You got it right.
Mr. Heretical Truth. One Heretical Truth on X. I'm enjoying the new branding. I like it.
Me too.
Anything to depart from what it was becoming. Welcome, Mr. Adam Ellwanger, and thank you for joining us on short notice. Good morning. It's me again over on Rumble. We've got people filtering in, so I'm trying to tease a little bit. But we have the man with us this morning from, good morning, Justin. Hello. Glad to see you. We have the man, the professor, the writer, the editor, the fellow of the Claremont Institute, Mr. Adam Ellwanger. And I became aware of Mr. Ellwanger just a couple of weeks ago when Norm and I were discussing the immigration issue. As our listeners and viewers know very, very much by now, Norm and I are preoccupied, I guess one might say, with the fundamental and primary purposes of a unified immigration policy for a civilized nation such as the United States. And Norm has referenced a book that has been really ragged on in recent decades called The Camp of the Saints. I'm not sure, Adam, if you've had an opportunity to read that. I do commend that to you. It's hard to find, so we can speak offline if you need help locating that. Camp of the Saints is a fictional account of a country that, oddly enough, experienced in the book exactly what we're seeing happen across the Mediterranean and Western Europe with the massive influx of tens of thousands of migrants into what should be sovereign borders, and very similar and parallel to what we're seeing occur at our southern border through Texas, Arizona, and California. And the seeming seizure of the citizens of these host nations of their ability to assert their rights and their duties to have the government, whether state, federal, or local, advance and guard their interests as is required by the Constitution. Failure of their ability to avail themselves of the laws through the courts in an effort to stop this. And what results is ultimately a dislocation of the ruling class from the citizens that occupy their tax base and who they presumptively, or which that ruling class presumptively represents both domestically and in geopolitical circles. So narrowing in on that, I'm an avid listener of the American Minds podcast. And I think I've even listened to their one from this morning. And at the end of that podcast, Adam, I think I told you when we mentioned you in our tweet about, or our post rather, about our stream that day, that the hosts of the American Mind at the end of every show, they have a segment that I really enjoy called Read the Damn Site. And in that segment, one of the hosts suggested to us the article How to Turn a Cold War Hot. And I listened to the recommendation. I went and I found the article on the American Minds website. I'll put that here on the screen so that we can remind everybody. And we talked about that a little bit. I don't know that we really got to get into the details that day, but here it is: How to Turn a Cold War Hot. And Adam, before I get too far into the substantive nature of this sort of discussion, I'd like to just pull back and give everybody a little taste of who you are, what you do on a day-to-day basis when you're not writing hard-hitting articles for the American Mind. You're a family man, you're a professor, so tell us a little bit. Thank you for being here as well.
Well, thanks very much for the invite, Michael. I enjoyed y'all's conversation about the article the other day. I am a professor of rhetoric at the University of Houston downtown. I have lived in Houston for 15 years. I am indeed a family man. I've been with my wife for over 20 years now. And my kids are growing up rapidly. And I would say that a concern for the America and the world that my children will inhabit is a major motivator for me in terms of the work that I do. So I have my university work. And then I am a frequent commentator on politics and culture. I try to write every day. I am usually done with getting the kids home and stuff like that at about 3:30. I try to spend about 2 to 3 hours after that writing before dinner. And so what you have there on your screen is the product of one or two of those sessions. And this one was, I guess, sort of a response to the frustration that I had in seeing agents of the federal government cutting razor wire at the Rio Grande River that Governor Abbott in the state of Texas had placed to deter immigration, in the face of the federal government's refusal to do anything to stem the tide here. And it seemed to me that we had really gotten to a point where it seemed like a stalemate. The federal government had said both, we are going to do nothing to secure the border. And it seems increasingly that they're saying to the state of Texas, and you are going to do nothing to secure your border. And that seems to me to be an untenable situation, one that could very well inflame some of the hostilities that the federal government seems to or pretends to be very, 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 very concerned about. And it's difficult to understand why, if their fear of these hostilities is genuine, then why do they seem intent on putting the Republic of Texas in a situation where they have no choice but to either openly defy the federal government or essentially surrender their state sovereignty? And it's important to understand that when we're talking about Texas, that state sovereignty was a key condition of their joining the union. That the state of Texas has a unique history, and that maybe that tradition of state sovereignty has a little more strength, say, in Texas than it does in New York or Oklahoma.
I was thinking this morning, and sorry to interrupt, I was thinking this morning about this thread in particular that we can pull out a little bit. I was born and raised, and I still live in North Carolina. If you spend any time listening to these streams, you're more likely than not to find a soundbite of me saying that North Carolina is the center of the known universe. and Norm plays around with that. He thinks it's funny. But what I know for sure is that while I have never spent any real time in Texas, I've had friends that have relocated there for work and various things, moved out, but never spent any real time in Texas. That has not, I guess, disabused me of the cultural impact that Texas is, that patina of what we consider to be sort of archetypal Americanism, right? That sort of manifest destiny that has drawn itself back into a civilized discourse, right? The right to exercise one's religion, the right to property, the right to sow your own seeds, right? Fruits of your own labor, and the willingness to find a righteous fight and be courageous enough to take the fight if that fight is necessary. I think that the essence of what I just said is really what is under or threatened with extreme dilution, right? To a point where it's unrecognizable and is something of only historical perspective at that point with this immigration issue. And that's why I find that this issue of federalism so important right now. What you just described in terms of Texas's right to self-determination and its own state sovereignty, that is the 10th Amendment in practice, when in contrast to federal immigration policy as applied in this case. So, in this, I think I saw where they had the buoys across the Rio Grande, Adam, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they had the buoys across the Rio Grande, and the federal government came in and said that there was a likelihood of drowning, et cetera, because of that. And Texas's response was, correct, we don't want to encourage people to drown, right? We want to prevent them from coming here, but instead they had to remove those buoys. And I'm not sure if they actually put them back or not. So, but the issue is necessarily that there is some sort of back and forth. There is some sort of volleying of obviously disparate interests between the government of Texas and the federal government. And it's extraordinarily important because, as we know, and as is part of American lore, Texas's economy is the size of, many Western European nations, right? Or even larger than that, right? And it is self-sufficient to the extent that, there's always the quip in American discourse that Texas could secede again without real recourse, right?
Well, I think that the secessionist movement, when I moved to Texas 15 years ago, I thought of it as something of a joke. By birth, I'm a New Yorker, a Western New Yorker, Rochester, New York. And so Texas has always seemed a little quirky to me. And I'm not sure that in the eyes of real native Texans, I can ever be one. But I think that recent events have made it difficult to dismiss the growing secessionist movement in Texas. I do think that,
and you say that it sounds like you're naturally dubious of that, right? I would just fairly to say that, because I think that I would necessarily be as well. I'm registered independent politically, and I spent many of the younger years of my life trending towards what was a Democratic Party that is wholly unrecognizable in its current state and form. And any notion that any state would want to break apart from, the United States of America, to me was just sort of wholly rejected without giving any sort of real scrutiny or thorough analysis of what that would mean, and what that would indicate is sort of a failure of certain conditions that precede that union, right?
yeah, I think that secession is probably a non-starter, regardless of how badly any state wants it. I think that what we saw in the Civil War, with a much weaker federal government at the time, that when a state or group of states secede and decide that they no longer want to be a part of that union, the federal government is not going to say, all right, well, bye. And I think that they would not be eager to give up Texas, which has, I think, a majority of the U.S. Mexican border.
Yes,
and so that's a non-starter. But it is important to allow, as you said, the people in a given state to make decisions for themselves about how they want to live. And it seems to me that there's a hypocrisy going on here too, with the federal government, because California can do whatever it wants, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if they want to legalize marijuana against the federal law, then the federal government will look the other way. If San Francisco wants to declare themselves a sanctuary city and say that they will not enforce federal law, the federal government will look the other way. The same will happen in Washington or New York or Colorado or Oregon or Nevada, right? But when Texas decides that it wants to enforce the law, if the federal government doesn't want to enforce it, which is exactly what the case is in terms of border security, then the federal government will not allow a sovereign state of Texas to enforce what should be federal laws that are followed. And so there's a growing sense of desperation that there's just no way out, and that the choice that we've been presented with, and you got it on the screen right there, and I'll read these premises. I think this really is the unstated policy of the federal government at this point towards Texas. The premises are 6, and it's: the federal government will not secure America's border with Mexico. That's premise 1. Premise 2, from the federal government's perspective, is the state of Texas may not secure its border with Mexico. Premise 3 is the federal government will not deport illegal immigrants. Premise 4 is Texas may not deport illegal immigrants. The 5th premise is the federal government can distribute new arrivals to whichever state it wants, whenever it wants, as it sees fit. So in other words, we've seen these stories of these night flights that the Biden administration is overseeing to deliver migrants to this place and that place.
And I do encourage our viewers to take an interest. If you don't live in a major municipality, you're not immune to that as well. 2nd, 3rd, 4th tier cities in every state are receiving, and perhaps in descending order there, probably the 4th and 3rd tier cities in each state are the ones that are seeing the biggest burden as to what you're talking about right now. Sorry for the interruption.
I think that's right. And the sixth premise is that, on the contrary, Texans must keep people who arrive in Texas. So we've seen that governors like DeSantis in Florida and Abbott in Texas have attempted to drive home the severity of this crisis by sending migrants to New York City, to Martha's Vineyard, to Washington, D.C. And what we've seen is the Biden administration has said, well, they haven't enacted this yet, but they've floated the idea of a remain in Texas policy. So they nixed Trump's remain in Mexico policy. They said, you can't do that, right? So they're going to let them over the border, but then they're going to tell Texas, but you have to keep them in Texas unless we want to send them to Omaha, Nebraska, or Rochester, New York. And then we can do that, but you have to keep them. And I think that the sum result of these six premises here is a real desperation. There is no off ramp, right? And so as long as these conditions hold, Texas is becoming a pressure cooker. I think that Governor Abbott is trying to release a little of that pressure to de-escalate the situation, and he is not being allowed to do so.
Well, I want to tease what I've got on the screen here, where the subtitle to this section of your article is "Echoes of 1860 as the Conflict Intensifies," and I want to pull back for just a moment. I'm going to go back to your profile here on the American Mind, but there's two things I want to make sure that we talk about, and we don't have to go very deep. But one thing I'm interested in personally is your work as a professor in modern academia and how we might connect the two, what we see nationally in terms of what plays out at the southern border right now with respect to immigration, and then what you see as a professor, generally speaking, of your students and sort of the I guess the consciousness around these issues and where that disconnect really exists, because you said you're a family man, you're a father, you're a husband, and you have every incentive to secure the future of your household. And so I guess, to make this simple, how long have you been a professor at the University of Houston downtown, and have you seen what observations have you made, and have you seen any market changes, positive or negative, in the last several years?
So the University of Houston downtown has an interesting situation. It is not the University of Houston main campus, the Cougars that most collegiate sports fans would be familiar with. We are in downtown Houston. We have a student body of roughly 15,000 undergraduates and graduate students. And we are a minority serving institution. Which means in practice that the majority of our students are Hispanic and Latino, in part because we serve the downtown area of Houston. This is also part of the Texas policy as regards higher education. Many of our students are either recent arrivals over the border, or the children of illegal immigrants. Many people don't know that the state of Texas, this is going on 20 years ago now, passed legislation that says that people who are in the country illegally are eligible for in-state tuition at public universities. Now you think about that, and we think of this as kind of a new thing that's happening. This is 20 years ago in Texas that this became policy. And so what this means is that I teach a number of people who have crossed this border. One thing for me that has been very important to hold on to is to, first of all, recognize the dignity of the people who cross this border. And I have to put myself in the situation as somebody who I've gone down to the border and looked at the situation on foot. Of course, one of the concerning points is that we see a lot of men, yours and my age, who are unaccompanied coming in.
Hang out, you know.
Right. That is a concern of mine, but there are families that come through, and I'm going to be honest. I can't say personally that if I was living in a cinder block box in the jungle of the Yucatan and thought that I could meaningfully improve my family's lot by crossing that border and taking the trek illegally, I cannot personally say for sure that I wouldn't do it. I think I might.
I don't think there's any question. I don't think there's any question of that, right? I think it's all signaling, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I think that we have to walk a very fine line between saying, look, it's, like if you're gonna, you can't say, hey, look, we don't want you to cross that border, but if you do, we're going to give you a driver's license. And if you do, we're going to give you access to our public schools and our healthcare. So don't cross that line. And if you do
like an episode of South Park.
If you do it, I swear we're going to pay for your college. So stay on that side of the line, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so, if you're faced with those incentives, of course people are going to move with their feet, and that just makes sense. The fault here lies with our government, who has ignored this issue for my entire lifetime. Really, we've had amnesties. The amnesties were supposed to fix this problem, right? Border security was supposed to be baked into those deals, and it just never happened, right? And so I think to answer your question, as a professor, I have to walk kind of a fine line when I discuss these issues, because I have to recognize that, many of these people many of my students live in communities who are full of people who have crossed that border illegally. And yet, this does not undermine the reality of the importance of a border, the importance of a nation, the importance of knowing who's in the country, especially when people are paragliding in to execute people in Israel as we speak, right? We've seen how terrorism can take us by surprise. We know that people from all over the Middle East, all over the world, have been crossing this border and simply released into the country with a summons, sometimes 3-4 years down the road. And we know from experience they will never come back. So it's of critical importance.
You just opened up another box with the WHO, which demographics are dominating the current surge across the border. And from my rote level understanding, it's not necessarily Mexican citizens, or it's actually from much further deep into Central and South America, and many African countries as well, Southwestern Asia, aka the Middle East. We are importing almost wholly people from those zones, those foreign zones, not Mexican citizens per se. So I perceive there to be some sort of contrast with the immigration issue as we would define it from 20 years ago, right? When you were saying that the Texas Department of Education decided that it was going to afford higher education to those who were not citizens, and what that promise might mean for the future, right? And what that promise might mean for those oddly enough, and this is going to sound crazy to a couple of our viewers in particular, and I'm not going to call you out, but it's going to sound crazy. But if we set aside for a moment the tenets of citizenship, and I don't want to minimize those, I just want to, for a moment, for this segment, say, let's set those aside for a moment, and let's imagine that there is someone who is 18 or 20 years old, who has grown up in America, who has taken advantage of this, the education system as maybe a sophomore or junior in college, and they are on their way, or let's say perhaps they were a little older when they arrived here, and they are actually living a full life. They have a mortgage, they have a family and a career, etc., in the state of Texas. At what point do they feel as though their rights and interests are being diluted by the federal government's policy with respect to illegal immigration and this migrant crisis as well? I think that there is a second and third order analysis to be made, because even though immigration has been an issue that has not been reined in for the last several decades, that is not to say that the not reining in, as I call it, is the same then as it is in this moment. Does that I guess ring true to you?
I think it really rings true. And I'll say a few things about it. One is, you asked what changes I've seen over the time that I've been a professor in Texas. And one is this, is that I think in recent years, especially since the Biden regnum, we've seen sort of first generation, second generation, and third generation Hispanic legal immigrants to Texas. In other words, people who have legal citizenship who maybe 10 years ago wouldn't have seen the border as a problem, have sort of awakened to the fact that this is just unsustainable. We can't just take anybody. And that at a certain point, if we continue to do so, who that hurts is first and second generation immigrants in Texas, who have the right to be here. A second thing is really kind of an unholy alliance. You're right that these are not just people from Mexico. Many of them are from further south in Central America, or even northern South America. But I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these countries, particularly in South America or Central America, who have dealt with intractable poverty, right? Those governments do not know how to meaningfully address the plight of their poor, are very happy to see these people walk, because it is not their lawyers and cardiologists who are making the trek to the border of Texas, right? What it is the people who have lived in intractable poverty in their society, who they do not know how to deal with, and are really kind of happy to see go. On the flip side,
transient population, yeah,
right. On the flip side, right, our nation, right, which has largely attempted in big ways and yet still failed in real ways to address our intractable poverty, is happy to take on the world's poor. And the reason, I think, is because, and this is pure speculation, right, but it's the way I try to make sense of this in my own mind. Why would we obviously take the world's poor? And the only explanation I can think of is that the more poverty we have, the more the state is justified. The need of a strong federal government and an expanded federal government is justified. So in other words, once these people are here, we're not going to deport them. They're living in abject poverty. Well, as we see, the government is already giving these people stipends to sustain them while they await their court dates, which they will probably never attend. Right? What are we going to do for these people 10 or 20 years down the road? The only thing that will address the problem, if we're not willing to deport, and we're not, right, is a strong federal government with an even stronger social safety net, which means more taxes, which means more bureaucracy. And I think that this is really what we're seeing, in essence, is the government using the border to shore up their defense against the populist backlash towards the administrative state. And this is a way to ensure, to hedge up that
beautifully said. And I couldn't agree more. I think in my sort of ham-handed handling of this mentally, I've always thought of this as sort of a pathway to the dilution of individual rights, because ultimately these people come over and they are entirely reliant on handouts, and they have not been assimilated to the values of an American citizen. That is, that our Constitution does not confer affirmatively any right to any citizen within our borders. It merely recognizes that those rights exist, that they were endowed by a creator, that each of us, citizens of the United States, were endowed by birth, by God, with a right to life, liberty, and property, right? The pursuit of happiness. And that within that is a certain element of self-reliance. And there is an underlying morality that pulls everything together and actually helps us maintain the judicial system and system of governance that we have, right? This moral compass. And my main concern with unbridled immigration is not that I don't know how to give dignity to another individual, that I don't know how to find common ground and see their humanity. It is necessarily that is endemic to this nation, and that it is not. We take it for granted that it might exist somewhere else out in the world. Guess what? It does not. It categorically does not exist out in the world. And if it does, the people who enjoy those fruits are not the ones who are coming across our border. The people who are coming across our border do not have values that are going to encourage them to be an entrepreneur, to try and understand how to contribute to a community, right? This is an abundance mindset. The people who are coming across our border are being preyed upon by a federal government, to your point, that is looking to use the public dole to politicize, to actually create a monolith of a vote, right? Under this illusion of what, and this is what I get irritated with, this frivolous use of the word democracy in modern parlance. It's an absolute joke. But and it's like no one's ever read C.S. Lewis, right? But to be candid, this use of democracy is such a misnomer, right? Because that is rule by the mob. And it's something that Norm talks about. There's nothing that scares him quite so much as a self-righteous mob, right? We have a Republican form of government. And that is that there are elements of direct democracy, but that citizens of a given locale elect someone to represent their combined interests. Why is that? Because we each come to this nation under our own sets of facts and circumstances. Our lives are inherently different. What's happening right now is this great collectivization of individual rights, this liquidation of individuality, and sort of a monotone vibe is being created across whether it's the fruited plains or whatever else, right? You can be in Oklahoma, Miami, Florida, or Manhattan, right? And what appears obvious to me is that the ruling class is hell-bent on creating a uniform experience in real life, no matter where you are, right? That we are erasing identity as a unique feature of communities across America. That I think that ultimately these people are mere vessels to that end, right? That the middle class will be wiped out if this is unrestrained, and there will be a clear caste system of haves and have-nots within another 20, 25 years.
Yeah, I think all that's right. And I also think that you mentioned sort of erasure of identity. And I do think that legacy Americans, people who have been here for generations, right? Legacy Americans have particular characteristics. They understand intuitively the natural right tradition that America was built on, because until very recently, we used to teach our children this. And I think that this has been a problem for what is increasingly, like you say, a monolithic administrative government. That legacy, the mindset of the legacy American, has become a hindrance to.
It's become labeled as terroristic activity domestically.
That's right.
There's no questioning that at this point.
Right. And so I think that if there's a secondary benefit of dissolving or weakening that identity of sort of the legacy American who is born a free man or woman, that's all the better in this process. But I also think you and I were talking before we started a little bit about the global phenomenon of migration, what's called migration. And we have to ask, like, why is this an international phenomenon? And I think that part of the reason is that in some ways, the natural right tradition that forms much of the West is what's accelerating this. We no longer, especially people of a leftist persuasion, they no longer know how to say, yes, you have inherent rights, but you cannot come here, right? They don't know how to draw a line of exclusion. Right. But they also can't grasp the fact that what a nation is exclusion. That's the precondition of a nation. If we can't exclude anybody, we just can't be a nation. Right. And so this is kind of the nihilistic sort of, I hate to use the word, but suicidal impulse of the West. Right. Is we're so committed to the ideals of the Enlightenment on an intuitive, not even an informed level, an intuitive level, that we just can no longer find the fortitude to say no more. And the contradiction is that we will lose the means to live in according to Enlightenment ideals, because they're forcing us into annihilation.
Yeah, well, it's been these ideals at least the programming thereof, have been commercialized so much through the higher education system. And I think that's why this conversation is such a perfect marriage. And perhaps it's better for maybe second or third meeting to discuss these things, and we can iron out in a little more disciplined detail where we want to go. But it does feel as though we are simpatico as far as directionally how this conversation unfolds. I think about the sort of cognitive dissonance that it requires for one to view any entity in the Middle East, especially right now, as having a righteous mandate for violence, right? To advance a cause or to secure borders, either way, right? But also here at home, to have no sense of identity, right? To have no sense of where the righteous fight exists to secure to secure our civil society, right? Our institutions, our federal government, our state governments, our individual rights to that self-determination, right? Where is that sense? And it's as if the programming is such that it creates this illusion that everything is okay at home, or if it departs from that mental model that one has and applies on a filter abroad, right? That there's some other justification for why it's okay here, right? And that's the sort of censorship that is the most insidious form of censorship imaginable to me. Is that we have taken young minds, we have inflated the cost of education, and without anybody knowing it, and without anybody being willing to say this, the mind has been pledged as collateral for that underlying loan that they're taking to pay for the education. And no one is allowed to think contrary to the establishment orthodoxy, lest they be pushed out of the economic system that they require to make good, if they ever can, on the loan that they had to take to become who they are right now, which is really sort of a dystopian future, because that is the ultimate collectivization of the mind and thought. Right? Is that no one feels confident or courageous enough to risk economic harm because they want to just exist and float in this system without, I guess, any sort of animus applied to them.
You mentioned commercialism in there, and I think that a part of what has hindered us in securing the border is the commercialization of the American dream. This is a contested topic, but I really do think that for younger Americans, certainly, the American dream means something material. It means, can I pay a mortgage? Can I live the lifestyle in terms of material things that I want? And I think that what this is the American dream we've exported. And so the people coming over the border in Texas are people who think that they're coming for the American dream because they say, well, I want a better life. And what they mean by that is, I want to be less poor than I am now. And I'm not sure that's really what the American dream ever was or should be. I think that the American dream is the older idea that we were just talking about, of the natural right tradition, and the ability to live as free people according to your freedom of conscience, to practice the kind of faith that you want. And I think that idea has been almost forgotten now. I was going to say impoverished, but it's really almost forgotten. And it's kind of...
I call that a failure of historical memory, right? Yeah. I think that's sort of the time that we're living in now, is that generation to generation, it occurs to me that the survival of a nation is wholly contingent still. I mean, it's funny to say this in 2023, but it's oral tradition, oral history, right? Family units being successful enough to pass down those ideals and that historical memory and that cultural memory to the successive generations to carry that forward, because everything on the outside can change, but that is the most difficult thing to break, I think, from a government perspective. I think my version of the American dream is just the freedom to fail, right? If one is allowed to fail, one is also necessarily, the corollary is, they're allowed to succeed as well, right? Where there is no allowance for failure, there's also no allowance for success, meritocratic success. I think that's what I would condense this issue to, is that people don't realize that by raising the floor ever so slightly, and how ineffective that the raising of that floor might be, that is to also lower the ceiling for everybody.
I think that's right, but I'll push back a little on that too. I think that for many of the people crossing our southern border, they're coming from places where everybody's allowed to fail. The problem is that very, very few people in those societies are allowed to succeed. And they recognize that, well, I don't lose anything. I don't lose my ability to fail by coming over there, but I gain perhaps a better chance of success. But, of course, the more people that come, especially the more people who are unadapted or unassimilated to American ways of life, our language, these things, the more those prospects for success get watered down.
Well, and certainly our definition of failure, I think, is different in this circumstance, because
Yes.
I recognize exactly what you're saying. I think failure is going to become the status quo, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
It's like failure becomes just sort of the lived condition every day to day because of the reliance on that welfare state, right?
Yes.
Everybody loses equally, right? So nobody's really losing, but everybody loses is ultimately the proposition there.
And then you look, though, at this photograph you have on your screen, and it always interests me to look at this. I mean, all of these people look like they just went to Walmart. Like what they're wearing, what their fashions are. It doesn't look like they are sort of
the soldier without any arms. Right? He's got literal arms, but no.
Yes, no firearms. Yeah. I will say, I think that Texas, this is another thing that maybe hinders Texas in this fight, is that, Texas, especially people to our south, perceive Texas as still in play as to who has the rightful claim to Texas. Six Flags Over Texas is named because it's had Six Flags fly over it. And I think that the people to our south are quite right that for much of recent history, this was Mexico, and there's a rich tradition here of for hundreds of years of people of very different backgrounds living together. And I think that there's this sense that Texas is for everybody. And in some sense, historically speaking, they're right. And this is something that hinders us from saying, but you can't come. Because Texas is still in play. There's still a little bit of the Wild West in Texas, especially down at the high mountain desert.
Well, this represents a clear, I'm a lawyer. So this to me, this topic gets us as close to a clear breach of the contract between, our elected government and the people it is formed to serve, by the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. And this is as clear a breach of that contract as I can imagine. I think the question is that no one really wants to answer honestly is any breach of contract claim is only as valuable as the damages one can assert, right? Resolution. What is the remedy, right? How are the American people made whole for the American government's breach of its clear and definitive obligations to our nation? And your article, and this is why I teased it, all of these factors go into recognizing that you make a very interesting observation of the era that was 1860, right ahead of the United States Civil War. And in particular, you talk about Abraham Lincoln's characterization of the Southern states. But if I understand correctly from reading this article, you seem to imply that Abraham Lincoln would characterize the federal government's behavior as synonymous with the behavior of the Southern states if he were alive today, looking at this circumstance. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do think that that's correct. I think that Lincoln was essentially saying there's nothing that we can do, that is the states in favor of abolition, to make the Southern states happy anymore. And that seems to be the case in the border states. Is there's nothing, we are just forced to resign ourselves to something that we cannot live with anymore. And that is what happened with the Union. The South wanted the territories to be slave states. And so at precisely the moment that the abolitionists thought they had a chance, it all of a sudden seemed as though the problem was going to expand, that they were going to lose ground rather than gain ground. And at that moment, I mean, in a sense, that lit the match, right? Because, you know, they were facing the prospect of being part of a slave nation rather than a union where we had this sort of detente where you do your thing and we'll do ours. And
Correct. Yep.
the state of Texas is no longer being allowed to do our thing. You know, there's strong majorities in Texas that need something to be done about this. And the state government, the elected government, is attempting to do so. And they are being told that they may not respond to this demand from their constituents. And to me, that's, you know, that God forbid, you know, nobody wants this, but it seems like maybe the match is about to be lit. I will say, I think that your characterization of it as a breach of contract is very interesting, because we have to ask also, like, what would be the costs of pursuing reparation, right?
That's exactly right. That's what I mean. Is that that is in the calculus of every decision to litigate or seek remedy, right, for the breach of that contract. And
the cost would be very high, I think.
Well, and it was extraordinarily high in the Civil War. It was hundreds of thousands of American lives, sons and fathers, brothers. And Norm is famous for quoting on here that, you know, 2 years after the Civil War, the Union had essentially, in a legal context, forgiven all of those secessionists, those in the southern states, that there were no additional prosecutions for insurrection or otherwise. And here we are, 2 years removed from what occurred on January 6, 2021 in the federal government. And Merrick Garland's DOJ is now appealing the sentences handed down in the Proud Boys convictions, right? They are appealing, saying that the sentences for Enrique Tarrio of 33 years and Joe Biggs of 30 years, not quite long enough, right, in the context. And so there is a real legitimation crisis between what is and what ought to be, and what we as citizens were promised and what is being delivered at this moment. And I'm not going to prolong this stream, but we certainly could look to what occurred in the Capitol yesterday as further evidence of that dislocation between the citizens and the government it elects to govern the country. So anyway, Adam, I want to say thank you again for being here. We've had plenty of Rumble comments. People are loving your subject matter on this, and I think it's really engaging. So I'd like to, when Norm is back from his West Coast wandering, to have you back on and perhaps discuss anything else that you've got coming in the pipeline. Do you have anything that you're working on that you'd like to tease now, or do you want to let this simmer for a bit?
There's always stuff, almost every week. If you go to the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, got an article that came out yesterday on belonging. And I think later this week, if you go over to American Reformer, I have an article coming out on the modern cult of the self. And I want to thank you very much, Michael. You guys have a great show, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to join and talk.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. For those of you watching, thank you. Make sure you have put a thumbs up on this video, whether you're on Rumble, on YouTube. If you're on X, please gift us that quote or that share. And you can find the audio-only version of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, Audible, wherever podcasts are found. And as I always say, if you're over there on the podcast platforms, leave us 5 stars and a nice comment, or just leave us alone. You know what I mean? Just, you know, you don't have to do anything if you don't do anything great. Anyway, Adam, again, thank you. We're grateful. I think this has been really enriching for us, and certainly I'm glad to have made a new relationship, even if it's digital and virtual for now. I wish you the best, and we'll be keeping track of you. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you later.